We're gonna go into strength training for boxing, and we're gonna start right now. So boxing is a very technical sport. There's a lot of power output. There's a lot of endurance involved. There's a lot of complicated factors that go into succeeding in the sport of boxing. That's why it's known as the sweet science. I can just picture Max Kellerman right now watching this video. Is so excited, so happy to learn about the sweet science and how physical resistance-based training can improve your power output, can improve your performance inside of the ring. And we're gonna go into all those key elements that are gonna make you dominate the sweet science and become a better fighter long-term. So that first key element that we've gotta focus on when we're training fighters, when we're training striking, when we're training boxing, right, is that we've got to understand power production. And when we think about boxing, we can think about guys like Mike Tyson, Lennox Lewis, these big, huge, hulking dudes. And then we might drop down the line. We start to think about Floyd Mayweather and Manny Pacquiao, and what makes these guys so powerful, what makes them able to dominate so well. And it comes back to that power production. But what does that entail? When we're talking about boxing, we have to realize that there's a different realm of power production. We want to have minimal hypertrophy, okay? So when we're training our fighters, we don't want to do a ton of work that will lead to these hypertrophic gains. Think about someone like Houston Alexander when he burst onto the scene in UFC, a decade ago or even longer. Maybe it was 10, 12 years ago. I think he came out and he fought Keith Jardine and knocked him out in like 45 seconds. And a lot of people looked at his physique. He was this big, huge, hulking animal. Now, he had tremendous striking power, but the problem was he couldn't last that long and he wasn't an overly technical fighter. He could throw his hands really well for a short period of time and he had really good striking power from that power production, but that hypertrophy that he had actually led to issues later on in his fights as he got deeper into the UFC. So we need that type of power production without that hulking individual. And so when I worked with someone like Carmelo Marrero, who ended up fighting Czech Congo and beating him, he's fought Gabe Gonzaga, Ryan Bader, all these really high level fighters. One of the big things that we needed to focus on was power production with minimal hypertrophy. And that's where it comes back to twitch force and stability. And if we can think about doing powerfully based movements that will increase our twitch force, which is that heavy hands, okay? Talking with someone like Kermit Cintron, this is a guy who's a former world champ, Antonio Margarita, some of the best guys in the world. He had really, really heavy hands, but that's because he had a very precise technique. And that's where we need to think about with boxing is we've got to get kids who understand bodily movement, and that can come back to that power production. They understand how to create stability to minimize any noise in their movements so that all of that power can go directly into that strike. And so that's the key factor here is that when we're in the weight room, all of the power production has to be based around how quickly can you react or how quickly can you apply force and how stable are you when you're applying that force. If you're more stable, you will be able to throw a more rapid punch, which in turn will create a more powerful punch. But again, we have to do this with minimal hypertrophy. So that second key element we're gonna be focusing on is gonna be force absorption. So when we're in the weight room, if we're doing power production based movements, think about throwing dumbbells or explosive clap push-ups or explosive push-ups to boxes, or even box jumps or hurdle hops, working, even technical coordination movements like a power clean or a power snatch or a dumbbell snatch. These are all movements that you can use to increase power production, but we also want to increase force absorption. And there's a couple reasons why. First, if we can learn how to absorb force, we can in turn take hits a little bit easier. So if we think about someone is punching me right on the chin and my head snaps back, the rate at which my head snaps back is what is gonna happen to my brain. My brain is gonna turn to a giant pile of jelly and I'm gonna get knocked out because my brain is smacking up against the skull at a very high rate, okay? That's why people get knocked out. If we can absorb that blow more effectively and we can handle the amount of speed that someone's applying to our chin or to our head or to our gut, and we can absorb that by training different modalities with force absorption. Think about doing a power clean and absorbing that. Think about doing explosive high pulls to build bigger traps, to build more explosive neck muscles. Now we can handle punches a little bit more effectively. And then that's gonna take us into if we can handle and absorb punches and absorb blows, we're actually going to be able to increase our power output because of that. So if we learn how to do a drop off of a box and react quickly over a hurdle rapidly, our body is learning how to absorb that force, contract, and reuse it more effectively, and that's what we can do when we're in the ring, okay? And that's gonna lead to our reactiveness. If we work on our footwork in the ring, and then we do specific movements in the weight room that mimic our technique, now our footwork that we might be doing, we can also start to apply a little plyometric work, and Nick Kirsten does a really good job with this from Speed of Sport. So that's some really important factors, is that if we improve our footwork in the ring and we improve our force absorption with better footwork, not only are we gonna increase our technique, we're gonna increase our power output. And then finally, when we're talking about force absorption, we have to recognize dynamic trunk control, okay? Dynamic trunk control, the key factor here is going to be based around co-contractions in the hips and in the trunk. And if we can train fighters in the weight room, the skill of co-contractions, this is a skill, okay? Now our hips provide more stability. Our trunk provides more stability. And when we provide more stability from our hips and from our trunk, we can apply greater force into that punch, and that twitch force becomes much higher. So that's a key component here, is how can we absorb force? And we absorb force by learning co-contractions in the hip and dynamic trunk control to improve that overall power output. That third key factor is going to be understanding technical coordination. Okay, so I just mentioned dynamic trunk control and co-contractions. Co-contractions is part of this technical coordination. Co-contractions are a skill. Boxing is skill-based, okay? If you're a lay person, we watch fighting, we watch MMA, we watch boxing, and we think it's just dudes and women going in and just brawling. But what we don't see as lay people is all the footwork that everyone is doing, all the combos that everybody's learning how to execute, and all that precise technique work. And that's where technical coordination comes into play. A lot of boxers don't do any type of weightlifting. They don't do power snatches, they don't do power cleans. They don't really want to dip into that realm. But I want to bring up someone like George St. Pierre, okay? George St. Pierre trained with Pierre Waugh, who was a great Canadian strength coach who focused on weightlifting movements, power snatches, full snatches, because of what it did for dynamic trunk control and understanding how to use your hips from the ground. And that's where I will also say, with technical coordination movements, now we can take someone who is a little bit more aggressive and they're just focused on hitting somebody as hard as possible and get them to realize that, hey, there's a lot of technique in this sport. And when you understand the technique, now you're gonna be able to conquer that chess game inside of the ring. So I believe utilizing power cleans, power snatches, keeping it simple, dumbbell snatches, stuff like that, simple weightlifting movements to train the way the brain thinks so that they understand how to coordinate from the ground up, how to use their hips more effectively, how to use their feet more effectively to then stabilize their hips, to then have greater power output. I think that's a really key component to understand and learn multiple combinations when they're inside of the fight. And in turn, then they have better force absorption because they're using these technical coordination movements to learn how to absorb that force rapidly. And then finally, that leads to greater power output because they've learned how to accelerate a heavy weight and catch that very strongly. So I think technical coordination is a really key component behind boxing that feeds into force absorption and improves that power production. So when I first started getting into strength and conditioning, this is gonna be a little bit of a story. One of those key things that I learned from working with someone named Ross Enamite from Ross Boxing. So I started to dive into Ross's information. This is back 2007, 2008. This was around the time I was working a little bit with Carmelo. This was also around the time that I was working with local fighters and even working with Kermit Cintron's earliest coach, his coach from a young age, okay, and even talking with Kermit. One of those big things that Ross, that Kermit, that Carmelo, that all of these guys brought up was that conditioning is king. Okay, we've got to have really, really good endurance. But when I started to dive deeper into what does that mean for boxing? What does endurance mean? I think it's easy for us to think about Rocky. He's out running, he's wearing that jumpsuit and he's just jogging, he's wearing his plastics and everything, and that's gonna make him the most endurance-based athlete inside of the ring. But there's more that goes into it. I believe that when we're training in the weight room, endurance has to be focused on long periods of high cognitive function. So what does that mean? When there's a fighter who's in round 8, round 9, round 10, they have to be able to tap into their brain and control everything as high as they can. Now they're getting beat up, they're getting banged around, but they still need to execute very, very precisely. And if we can think back to our power production, if we can minimize the noise in their movement, okay, if we can make their hip more stable, if we can make their core more stable, if their footwork is on point, that minimizes that external noise, okay? Now they can still strike with a large amount of power output, but those are skills that requires a lot of cognitive focus. So that's a key component behind endurance, is that we need to be able to control their cognitive function and in turn have high power output late in the fight. So now if we can go back to our discussion with Houston Alexander, that was his big downfall, was that he had a ton of power output in the first 60 seconds, but take him through a long fight and he's done. He's done after 3 or 4 minutes because he was so hypertrophic. Now there's going to be some work that we do in the weight room that is power production based that will lead to some hypertrophy gains, but we can do more power production work and force absorption work and technical coordination work by focusing on increasing our relative strength. Okay, so if we're focusing on increasing our relative strength or our pound for pound strength, there won't be as much of a hypertrophic gains, which in turn will lead to better endurance. Now, I recommend with the endurance stuff, yes, it's cool to go out, go for a jog once a week. I think that's perfectly fine, but I also think that we can play around with games like on the minute drills with power cleans, or every 30 seconds you have to execute a power clean and you do that for 20 minutes straight. That's a lot of work that requires high cognitive function. I think you can also do bouts on the assault bike. You can do slow, long duration bouts on an assault bike or on the rower, and in between, you can do different rounds, you can do different shadow boxing drills as well. I think those are great ways that a lot of fighters can actually develop their boxing long term. And that's one thing that I'll point out. I was fortunate enough to be at the Tokyo Olympics and see an Olympic champion early in the morning, right before his fight, shadow boxing, going through all those drills, going round by round by round, focusing on the key combos that he learned to try to execute that. And that's part of that endurance-based training. So I think that's a big factor here, is that we've got to look at boxing slightly differently. Focus on power production with minimal hypertrophic gains. Execute really good force absorption drills inside of the weight room. Bring up technical coordination, understand what foot strength can do for boxing, understand what core strength and hip stability can do for power output, and then finally be creative with those means of endurance-based training methods, because we don't need to just go out and run all the time. There's other ways that we can do this a little bit more effectively. So if you need help with that and you need creative ideas to improve your strength training for boxing, click on the link down below, head over to garagestrength.com, and you can pick up our 12-week strength training for boxing program that can help you become a dominant force inside the ring. Until next time, guys, peace.